Hello and welcome to another episode of CIES Talks, a new podcast series in which we dive into the fascinating world of sports management, education, and research, featuring insights from top experts across the industry. This podcast is brought to you by CIES, the International Center for Sports Studies, an independent study center located in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, which provides cutting-edge research and world-class education to the world of sports. For more information, please go to CIS.ch. Among other things, the CIS organizes Europe's leading sports management postgraduate program, the FIFA Master, which was my first introduction to CIS some 23 years ago. I am Kevin Tallec Marston, a senior research fellow and lecturer at CIS. I teach, research, and write about the history and governance of sport, curating ideas about how and why sport is so significant. And it was in the context of thinking about sport as a vehicle for wider social development that I first met today's guest, Dan Cade, nearly 20 years ago. Dan had enrolled on the FIFA Master and was imagining a topic for his research project in the nexus of sport and development. Over the years, we've had the opportunity to collaborate on several projects that were connected with the Master, and so it's been a joy to remain in touch. Dan Cade is a leading figure in sustainability and sports development. He's worked with the most important sporting organizations on these topics, a number of different organizations, including UEFA, Nike, World Taekwondo, the FAI, the International Biathlon Union, and many, many others, and countless specialized NGOs. It's a true pleasure to have Dan with us today. So Dan, welcome to CIES Talks.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Thank you. It's great to see you, and great to have you on the podcast today. So how are you doing? You're all well?
Very well, yeah. Enjoying the summer and trying to stay cool here in my basement today.
Yes, aren't we all? Very good. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I think, we discussed about how we wanted to go through this podcast today. And I think what we're going to try and do is structure this in two parts, really. One is to talk about you coming into the CIS universe, the FIFA Master world, and then particularly we'll spend a lot more time on your career and the specific areas that you have been working in over the last few years in consultancy, CSR and sport, and then particularly these last few years as you started your own company and working in sustainability, really having garnered quite a lot of expertise in these areas. So I think we'll structure it in those two parts, and we'll try to storytell our way through who is Dan Cade these last 20 years. So maybe, Dan, could you take us back to the beginning, 20 years ago, around 2006, 2007, when you started this journey into the sports field?
Yeah, thanks, Kev. It sounds like it might be a bit of a therapy session for me, actually. But I'll try and keep it interesting. So my decision to come to apply for the FIFA Master came out of, I guess this is a big plot spoiler, but I love sport. I've always loved sport, and I've always seen football, especially as my companion. It's been there longer than many of my friends. I started playing football at a very young age, and for a while felt like I was doing nothing else. And I found myself, after university, I was sort of did a cool year in New York, and then was working in the city in London for a corporate company, and it just didn't feel right. Probably many people have had this feeling as well. And I remember sitting on the underground on the tube one evening and thinking, what do I actually want to do with my life? Because I'm pretty sure it isn't this. and I realized I wanted to work in sport. Now at that point, I didn't really know what that meant. Work in sport. My sort of view of sport was, the Premier League and the Olympic Games and the World Cup. So I started digging around, and I found the FIFA Master course, and I started speaking to a few of the people that had just taken the course, some of the other English alumni. And they were able to give me a good insight into what to expect. And to cut a long story short, I suppose I applied, and that was really during the course. I feel like that was when I realized that I could make a career out of this, and what sort of career that might be. I suppose it wasn't like this is going to be my path right then, but it was at least there exists in this industry an area of work that I'm quite interested, that kind of, appeals to me, and clearly I'm someone that needs to feel that, that they're doing things for the right reasons, and this appealed to my heart, to my soul, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, so that was the decision, and it was, I think, a very good decision. I don't know if you want me to start speaking about my time on the course as well. I can go into that and a little bit.
Well, I think Dan, maybe I'll pick up on a couple of the things that you mentioned, because particularly I think this will be relevant to many of the people who will be listening and watching the podcast. Is that moment in life when you've got your career settled, it's out and going, and it's not exactly what you're wanting to do. And then you have the eureka moment. Here's what I found. And in your case, you were able to bring together an interest and a passion and a knowledge and an experience in sport with something that would then become a career through studying, particularly. And all of that being anchored, I think, in what you said at the end, which is, you're someone who wants to be doing things for meaning. You have to have a sort of, let's say, ethically integrated and ethically grounded approach to sport. Maybe that's something that we'll certainly pick up on, because that is core to a lot of the topics that you've worked on over the years, monitoring and evaluation, research, etc., which is trying to really use sport as a vehicle for ethical human activity, I suppose, in many ways. We'll come back, I think, to some of these things, but maybe you could take us through briefly your experience on the program. I know we have a few hidden surprise visuals that might illustrate one or two key fun points from your year on the course. But in that sense, could you take us through how perhaps the FIFA Master helped you, in that sense, bring those pieces of the puzzle together, maybe where it opened your eyes to certain things? And then particularly, I think the interesting link for you is that you spent quite a lot of time working on a research project, which ended up really pushing you, or you were driving it perhaps into the direction which you've been going for the last 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So I think maybe what's a little bit undervalued, or maybe not spoken about too much about the course, are the other students in the class. And I think there was a lot of thought behind how who would be in the class when the applications came in, what would be the diversity in the course. We ended up with 30 students from 27 different nationalities, I think it was, in our class. And all of these people were passionate about sport. So that, for me, it's fantastic coming in, because I was passionate about sport. I wanted to, I was really keen to learn about the industry, what's out there, what exists potentially in terms of a career. And these people were coming from their own cultures, their own countries, with their own stories of what sport is like there as well. And that coming together in Leicester at De Montfort University, where we spoke about the culture of sport, the history of sport, where it came from. For me, that was the best time. It was, unfortunately, it was a bit like it was a high, and then the management stuff and the law stuff didn't appeal as much to me. To others, it did. But I loved my time in Leicester, kind of investigating where sport came from, its community roots, its factory roots. We talked about sport and about football in particular. And to understand all that, it sort of was putting some blocks in place that hadn't been there before, and the foundations that I'd built about sport. So it gave me more meaning, this cultural perspective on things gave me more meaning. And was helping to build something at the time. And then, we had, I loved the people that would come in and tell us about Robben Island, for example, in South Africa, and Vladimir Bokovic from
Street Football World at the time. Yes.
Yeah, he came in. That was a big moment for me, hearing directly from him about sport and development. because that was a new term at the time, and something inside of me clicked when he came that day, and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And then, as you say, the idea about the final project that came out, that sort of came from that. I just wanted to make sure that whatever I ended up doing touched upon something concerning sport and development. And later, this other new term that I learned about during the year was CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Well, maybe we can pick up on that, because there is an interesting bit here. Obviously, during those first few months of the year, you're going on an intellectual curiosity journey in many ways. You're opening your mind to a lot of things. You're putting puzzle pieces together. You had exposure to different staff members, speakers. You mentioned Vladimir and Chuck Core. I think we even have a picture of that day, of that session. Perhaps we'll find that and post it up here in the webinar. But those interactions were helpful to you in terms of understanding a field that was growing. So you mentioned CSR and sport development. Those were very, very new fields in many ways. And so maybe what we could talk about is how, in the context of a new field, how do we define things? Because I think that was maybe one of the difficulties in those early years. I mean, this is 20 years ago when people were talking about CSR was a common, well-known term in corporate business. But how did it actually impact sports world? And this is something where you really interested yourself into this with some of your classmates, and then you tried to link your research project, your dissertation, directly to this question, which I think was a wonderful example of how the course actually marries academic integrity, research ethics, etc., and real world issues and problems. So maybe you could touch a little bit on the state of CSR, how it was defined, how it was understood, and then what you explored.
Yeah, it was Pierre Lanfranchi that first introduced me to the term corporate social responsibility. I had up until that point just eyes for sport for development, using sport as a tool for sort of teaching gender equality, including vulnerable groups in society, refugees, asylum seekers, and so on. That was, or using it just simply for health purposes, physical activity for health. So these were the areas that were interesting to me, and it was Pierre that sort of brought to my attention this new idea in sport. It was a new idea at the time, as you say. It wasn't so much a new idea in wider industry of corporate social responsibility. And I think FIFA had already named their department, or in that year, 2006, they'd named their CSR. They had a CSR department. And over the years, it's changed. And, UEFA called it football social responsibility. I think around 2008, that term came in for them. But underneath it all, as I sort of came to realize, is this ethical way of doing business. It's okay, is this the right thing for us to do? Who are our stakeholders? How do we affect what their interests? How do they affect our work? And how do we make decisions that are in line with that understanding? It's sort of a considerate approach to business. And again, it's another thing that resonated with me. Yeah, why wouldn't businesses consider the impacts they had on communities, on individuals, on wherever their products are landing and where their services are provided? Why wouldn't they consider the impacts, negative and positive, that they have on society? So I was like, yeah, absolutely, and in sport as well. Sign me up. And there was a few others, Leondios and Raju and Carolyn Rickers, who we got together and we did a project together on CSR and how it can, the way that it could add value in different areas for FIFA, basically, at the time. I think it was a way for us to explore the idea. Again, it was a new concept for me, for all of us, I think. Exploring what that means in sport, and it gave me a good platform to sort of then go on to certain things afterwards with that understanding, and having met people like Vladimir, people like Federico at FIFA, and some others who I've probably forgotten this time. But yeah, it gave me a good platform to then move on after the course and be more informed about my search, my job search.
Well, thank you, Dan. I think maybe that's a nice segue, in fact, to that next phase of your life, kind of post-graduation here. So you mentioned you were able to connect with a lot of interesting people in the fields that you were looking to explore. And then, so after 2007, July 2007, in your own personal career journey, take us through the next couple of years, because you worked very closely on a whole host of sport and development CSR projects at that time, some with Nike, some with UEFA, and then the Responsible project, which ran for a very long time. Really, really interesting. And you know, I'm very grateful because we got to collaborate on the Responsible for a number of years. So maybe take us through those years, perhaps also what you learned, and maybe some of the interesting questions that were not answered maybe by that during that period.
Well, I landed a great job afterwards. I don't know how, but well, actually, it wasn't the job I wanted. The job I wanted was going to be in South Africa, working towards the World Cup in 2010, because we graduated 2007. So that there were maybes and then no, actually, and then maybe, and then, but what came up in the meantime was a position working on evaluating the social projects of the UEFA Euro in 2008 as a consultant. So working with a company, a small consulting company at the time for UEFA, and monitoring at the matches. So I got to go to the matches. It was really, you know, glamorous situation for me at the time. Surveying fans, asking questions about various different projects. It was health related, I think, and goodness me, inclusion, fan relations. Can't even remember anymore, but it was great. I was in the action. I was monitoring and evaluating social projects, working with universities as well to evaluate things. I was learning a great deal of things, and then it sort of spawned a relationship with UEFA that lasted many years up until I started my own company recently. And alongside of that, as you say, we were working with Nike, who in those days were really focused on sport and development. And they were really interested in building an evidence base, because one of the concerns at the time, we know that sport brings people together. We feel that we feel that using sport as a tool for development can help us to reach humanitarian goals. But where's the evidence base? So Nike were very concerned on help on asking us to build tools for their management tools that we could share with NGOs that they were funding to develop this evidence base. So whether it be gender equality, health promotion, HIV/AIDS prevention, these were tools that we could offer them to the NGOs to collect evidence, to monitor, and to build that evidence base. So this was all going on at the same time. And then Responsible was basically at the time when football clubs were really getting into understanding what CSR was. I remember there were a few that had, one or two, like Wolfsburg in Germany was a really quick one to get on. They had a report in 2009 on CSR. Was it Corinthians? There was a Brazilian club, Corinthians perhaps, that had but many were not doing anything. And for many, the term social responsibility was a new word for them. So we built Responsible. Actually, it was someone from Nike that gave us the idea and said, what about building a ranking that could help clubs to understand what CSR was, or what social responsibility is, by developing indicators and ranking them, to create some sort of competition around it, to encourage them to see what the best ones are doing and try and reflect that. So that started, I don't know, around 2009, I think. And
clubs being very competitive organizations, I'm sure, it was quite quickly, I think, became something of interest to the field, not just in in terms of, the governing bodies, which are supposed to be vested with the, greater interest of sport. But here you have real actors in the industry, the clubs who are running stadiums, they're running events. So they're, from a sustainability point, we'll come back to some of that, but they are the real actors day to day in the field of sport. And so having them involved in the whole field of corporate social responsibility, I think is a huge achievement and really something fascinating in that point. But in that sense, is there anything that what are the maybe 2 or 3 key takeaways and learnings that you've taken away from those early years that you worked right after graduation up until around after the Euro 2012, for example? Were there things that really stuck out to you as this was paradigm shifting or something really interesting that you pulled out? Or perhaps there were some unanswered or unsolved questions at that point where maybe those are things that you picked up again later in the future?
Yeah, one of the things, so we actually split the responsible ranking into environmental, social, and governance indicators at the time. And this was before the term ESG existed or really was commonplace. And the discussion at the time was, should we include environmental measures in that? There's not really anyone doing anything in environment at the moment, and is this going to make everyone's score go really low down? Because at the time it was more the social stuff. The sport and dev was focused on social impact, and so we did, and the scores were low. Interestingly, we noticed over the years that the Eredivisie in the Netherlands rose rapidly up the ranking, and we found out a couple of years afterwards that they'd gotten hold of the indicators and shared them across the clubs, which was great. Looking back, why not? Absolutely do that, because that's for the better of football. And so they went to the top of the league, because they were looking at the indicators, and I think that's another principle. We have to share what we produce, in this industry. Yes, it's good to have competition among organizations, healthy competition, but we need to collaborate as well, especially in this area, sustainability, impact, purpose, whatever you're going to call it, because there's not much in terms of regulation right now. Maybe this is another discussion I'm going into, but there isn't much that exists in terms of regulation in the industry, in our sector. So unless we're sharing, unless we're explaining why we're doing things, sharing good practices, and there's a lot of this happening, then things don't progress, things don't become the norm. And when they're not the norm, then they're not expected. And that's when we sort of stagnate. So
in a sense, what you were seeing in a way through this field of CSR and sport was a shift in some sense, a shift from direct competition to almost more collaboration, co-opetition, if I can use a made up word in that sense. And that's fascinating, because what that means is that as you are defining a field, you talked about, including environmental, social, and governance factors before ESG was actually a note of turn, and working on the almost the conceptual side of what is it that we are doing, what is it that we are identifying in terms of indicators? How are we going to create an evidence-based methodology? How are we going to create an evidence-based assessment, really, of all of these fields, which everyone says are important? But if you don't have the evidence, like I assume your vis-a-vis counterparts at Nike were saying, well, why should we invest if we're not sure that it's actually having an impact? And I know that the entire impact question has been something very key to you on that sense.
I should credit that to Rolf Schwery. So he's sort of he was my colleague in my first organization and has sort of acted as a mentor over the years. And he's always been very data minded. And I think his undergraduate was in sociology. So he's sort of come at it from that angle. And it's very clear that unless you have evidence, unless you can clearly measure what it is that you're trying to improve, then you're not going to be able to demonstrate accountability to anybody, and you're not going to be able to learn as an organization. You're not going to be able to improve at all. So yeah, that in my career took me a little bit over to reporting, to developing, suitable KPIs, collecting data, analyzing data, producing reports, which I believe is incredibly important. And we came close to getting a standardized reporting framework from the EU, which has since been watered down a bit. But I think it's so important for sports organizations generally now to be able to develop realistic indicators according to the objectives that they have in this area, and report and figure out who they're reporting to as well. It's not just, okay, let's just produce a report and get it out there, but who do we want to listen to this? Who do we want? Is it's staff, it's athletes, it's fans. Who are we reporting to, and in which way do they want us to talk to them? There's
and I guess this comes back to what you were saying about your initial understanding of the field in approaching this, a very stakeholder perspective, saying who are stakeholders, right? Who are we actually trying to serve in this field, and how does that then implement and impact the decision-making processes that we put in place? So maybe this is where I'd ask you to speak a bit more to the next phase of your career life, before you set up your own company. Over the course of the 2010s up to 2020, into COVID, and then maybe COVID would be the natural point to talk about some of the projects since then. But you said you worked on a lot of reviews, reporting, particularly I think with hat trick programs with the UEFA and that sort of thing. So maybe you could speak a bit more to some of the challenges and learnings that you've had in terms of particularly identifying empirically based approaches. So how did you, what were the indicators that you were working with in this field? How did you define those types of things, really?
Yeah. So UEFA started reporting on an annual basis on their football and social responsibility practice in 2012. So they'd already done 2 reports on their Euros in 2008 and 2012. And they started reporting on their day-to-day or year-to-year support or practice of social responsibility in 2012. And yeah, the big question was then, what do we use here as a framework? Do we just, a lot of it was sort of the start of football clubs reporting on the work that they do, but most of it was just community stuff at the time. So community outreach initiatives. And UEFA's setup at that point was they had a range of different partners that they worked with, mainly in social areas, but also they were offsetting at the time the carbon emissions. They were reporting on the work of those partners. So it was the Fair Network, it was Cafe, which is now accessible. It was Football Supporters Europe, Supporters Direct, and a number of others. TED is on, and so I was collecting the data from them. But yeah, we had to ask them at the beginning. The way we did it then was, what are your objectives with this funding that you're being provided? And based on those objectives, we set KPIs, and we set a kind of whole measuring data collection sheets, and set those things up for them so that they could then provide us with the data that we could then pull a report together. And we ended up finding, that as time went on, the football associations, the member associations were doing work as well. They started doing work in social responsibility during this time. We should probably acknowledge that in this report. Of course. And the football ecosystem, where do we draw the line? What's the scope of this report as well? Where's UEFA's scope of influence here? Where can we draw the line around the report? And in the end, the report got too big. It's like 125 pages. And we kept saying, we need to scale down. And I think this is a process that organizations go through. What's too much? Who's the audience here? What do we need to tell them? Sorry, to cut a long story short, we reported with reference to GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. We made sure that all the relevant governance indicators that GRI were asking for were in the report. And then we looked at what other areas were maybe material for UEFA to report on at that time. And there was the instruction that we gave was that was given to us was, we're unique. Football is a unique sport and should not be, doesn't fit into an industry-wide reporting framework like GRI at the time. So we kind of, with reference to at that time was kind of enough. What happened after 2015 was the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that became a relevant framework for us then to say, okay, so the UN has identified 17 global Sustainable Development Goals for the whole world, and sport is an enabler of many of these goals. How can we pick those relevant goals that UEFA is, or that football or that sport is contributing to, and demonstrate that in a report? So as time went on, we integrate GRI and SDGs into UEFA's social responsibility report.
That's really interesting, Dan. And I think maybe I'd pick up on one other point that you mentioned in passing about football and sport being kind of unique in that sense to some of what the GRI framework was working with. How much do you think today the frameworks have evolved to the point that sport is no longer really unique and needs its own, let's say, ESG measuring framework? Or, is it sufficient to say we could use external frameworks for this, external reporting systems, or does sport really need to come up with its own unique approach to this?
It's a difficult question, Kevin.
It's probably not a simple answer, but
yeah, it's not a simple answer. I think one of the issues that we've had in maybe defining or trying to answer this question is the specificity of sport, which we kept hearing about during the master's program, actually, and the social impact that sport can have, and the different impacts that different sports can have. So in trying to define a global sport reporting framework, you'd have to be very vague, certainly in the social area. In the environmental area, there's, you can count emissions, you can count waste. There are a lot of quantifiable metrics that you can pull together in the environment that you can use, and you can quite easily use frameworks that are out there already for for industry and for the wider industry. But because there are so many different, measuring health, okay, you can definitely measure weight and heart rate and things like that over time, but measuring inclusion, these are really difficult metrics, and it also depends on the activity that you're running as to how you can collect the data for that. So yeah, most international frameworks collect data in a social area on things like labor, on workforce, gender split, things like that, and that can be done in sport as well. That can be done across all industries. But the specifics for sport are so specific that I don't know if we're ever going to come up with something. There are frameworks out there. Responsible is one of them. GSBS, I'm not going to remember what the GSBS stands for, but there's another framework out there. Global Sustainable Sport is developing its own framework across 7 pillars of sustainability. So people are trying. I think the IOC and FIFA perhaps have looked at this and have thought, maybe this isn't really, maybe we need to allow people to do their own thing here. The problem is, if you're not all using the same framework, you can't compare with each other, whatever's apples and pears and whatever.
Hence, I guess the importance of sharing information across, the sharing of information that you mentioned, whether it's reporting, whether it's indicators, whether it's the actual results, all of that is key to developing a real harmonized approach to the entire sector.
I think where we are with it, sorry to cut you out there, Coach, just thought is still here. I think where we are with it is, let's use relevant frameworks that exist for industry in general, like There's one VSME at the moment that the EU has launched, the voluntary standard for small and middle-sized enterprises, which is quite a useful one for sport, which is one I'm using for a couple of clients at the moment. Let's add to that the specifics of our sport. So that's something that's written in a lot of these frameworks, is if there are specific indicators or disclosures that only relate to your sector or relate to your company, then you can add them in and you can report on them. So don't ignore.
For example, I think you mentioned to me the sailing one. Sport like sailing would have its own particular criteria for that, or the ATP, which does its carbon tracking thing, and UEFA had worked in a similar CO2 tracking metric for the competition. So I suppose every sport in that sense does have some opportunity really to develop its own specialized application in that sense. Is that what you're suggesting?
Certain sports focus on the inclusion of refugees, for example. Now that's not going to be in the EU's VSME framework, and it's not going to be in GRI's indicators, but it's relevant. And World Taekwondo, for example, they focus a lot on in refugee camps and providing the sport and using it as a tool to develop, to teach life skills and all the rest. And so that's something that is relevant for them to report about. It's relevant for them to measure. It's relevant for them to evaluate, and it's important for them to report on. So yes, it will depend. I think we need an agreement on a standard like VSME, because it cuts through these ESG. It looks at governance. Are you writing a sustainability report? Do you have someone responsible for this area in your organization? It looks at gender equality in the organization, and scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, carbon emissions. Are you reporting on that? So it has the spine and then you can add on, depending on your strategy, depending on sustainability strategy of the organization, you can add on relevant metrics on top of that, I think.
Well, maybe that would be a nice segue into the kind of last section of your career up to date. You mentioned about essentially defining sustainability, and it seems to me, Dan, that these last few years since the pandemic, you started your own company. Maybe you could take us through that. And in a way, I wonder to what extent all of that is really truly about defining what we mean as sustainability in sport, and can you take us through your own journey setting up your company, and then particularly working on these definitions and these metrics and indicators?
Yeah. Okay. So I set up my company because I just felt it was time to go alone. It was mid-pandemic, but that also kind of helped because things were going online, and my clients at the time were in Korea, Austria, and Ireland. So it was useful that technology was improving and we were able to do things online. I also set it up because I wanted to have a focus on education. I wanted to refocus on sport as well, because with the other company, we were kind of going in different directions. I wanted to refocus on sport, governing bodies in particular and the work that they do, but also on education, because what sort of was clear at that point, and is less obvious now, is that people may know about sustainability or the topic of sustainability, climate change, but unless they were sustainability manager, they didn't actually know what that meant for them in their organization, and especially not in their role on a day-to-day basis. So if they were in facilities management, what does that mean in terms of procurement for them? What supplies could they buy for the office that would meet the climate change or the environmental sustainability goals that the organization had in its sustainability plan? There was a lack of understanding, unless you're in sustainability as a manager or an officer, for people in the organization. So I've done since then, and thanks to technology improvements, a lot of online platforms. So started with the IBU, International Biathlon Union, and they built a really great sustainability course, which they've made a requirement for their staff. It's about a 3-hour course, and it looks at sustainability from 3 different levels. So from a macro perspective, what is sustainability for society? What are some of the issues? What is climate change? Defining things like the big picture stuff. Then on a meso level, so at an organizational level, what is sustainability in sport? Mm-hmm. For the IOC, for the IBU, what does that mean? And then on a third level, on the micro level, according to stakeholders, so national federations, organizing committees, athletes, staff, what does sustainability mean for them? So it's like, for the IBU, it's talking about sustainable snow production. It's talking about reducing travel for the staff and travel policies. It's again this ongoing question of gender equality and what can we do? Can we do sort of mentoring programs for female leaders to grow the number of female managers that we have as an organization? So that's just one example of an education course that I built, and a way to kind of sensitize people that don't necessarily work in sustainability to what sustainability means. That's the idea of these things, from my perspective anyway. And I've also built a tool on global sustainable sport, which is like a 5-module course looking at the core elements of sustainability in sport, right from, what are the definitions, what is a sustainable sport event, how do you build a sustainability strategy as a sports organization, and how do you measure impact and report as well. So as you're probably seeing from what I'm saying, that the drive here has been to try and explain this world to others that don't work in it, because unless they understand it, unless they incorporate it, we keep saying let's integrate or let's embed sustainability into our organization. Well, you have to start with education then. For many years, my mother had no idea what the hell I did.
Right. Isn't that the test, really? Everyone always says, if you can't explain it to a family member, a grandparent, and they still don't understand, then you need to work better on your short-term communication strategy. But that's good. If you're getting there, and now she's understood, then I think we're in the right place. So Dan, for you, what's next, really? Looking ahead, we've taken the journey up to today. We've looked at all of the different areas that you've worked in and the different aspects that you've developed. You mentioned you're working a lot on education in sports. That's interesting. In a way, you've come really full circle, if you will, over these last 20 years, because that's where you started 20 years ago, was the nexus between education and sport. And that now coming back full circle to where you are today. I would love to hear a bit more about what you see as the next challenges in this space, crossing through. CSR is still something that exists in the field today, but you've brought in sustainability questions. We've got the environmental stuff. So what do you see as next? What are the big challenges and opportunities, perhaps, in sport?
Yeah, well, I still think we're not quite there with, making this a core operational practice, let's say. I think it has definitely built momentum. There's been ups and downs. We're currently probably going through a down, given what's going on globally. But I think we're beyond a point of return. I think, people know about sustainability in the industry. Now, whether they could define it, that's another question, but they know it's important. It's an important consideration, and it often comes up in bidding documents. Host cities will have to look at their sustainability considerations and have to meet certain indicators, mainly on the environmental front. So again, this definition question, when I talk about sustainability, I talk about ESG. I talk about the whole spectrum of environment, social, and governance. For me personally, I think AI is gonna. It's an obvious one, but I really see AI taking hold in many ways in terms of, from an infrastructure perspective, stadiums will be smart. Stadiums are being smart, the photovoltaic panels that you can use, the geothermal wells, the rainwater harvesting, and using seaweed to feed the grass to avoid pesticides and herbicides, but I think in education there are many ways to use AI. So adaptive learning. Adaptive learning. Have you come across that, Kevin, in your work?
No, I know. Tell us more about
that. So you can use AI so when you're setting up an online course, you can have an assessment question, a quiz, for example, and based on the outcome of that the user has in that quiz or that assessment, AI can then provide a pathway, a learning pathway for that individual user. So, for example, if there are 10 modules, that user in particular gets an 80% pass on the first quiz, and some of the questions that they've responded to in such a way that they don't need to take modules 2 and 3, so they'll skip straight to module 4.
I see.
Or module 4, lesson 5, because the first 5, so AI can take on that role of providing people whether
streamlining the resources and the time that we're all using on different projects. And that, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the crossover between AI and education is a field that we're cultivating every day and learning more every day. It's fascinating to see what opportunities will be there, and particularly, I mean, in your space, linking over into the sustainability and development. This is, it's wonderful to see the potential for that. Well, Dan, I mean, this has been fascinating. I mean, we could certainly probably go on for hours and hours, as we often do when we chat. But I think maybe coming full circle, really, it's been interesting to see how you have started at a certain point with a certain motivation in sport, a passion, which is something that I think unites us all in many ways. And then, your journey through learning, education, research, particularly on the empirical side, because that's something that has been really, really strong for you. And I think that's a wonderful lesson for us all, that no matter what we do, we all need to be evidence-based. And that's key, because if you are going to outline the meaning and the reasons and the ethics behind what you do need to have an empirical basis in order to demonstrate that does have an effect and it does have an impact. So thank you for the reminder on that. And it's great to see as well all of these different fields that have grown so much along your journey, whether it's CSR, whether it's sustainability, whether it is just the general approach to sport as a tool and not just as an end in itself. So I think that's certainly something we can all keep in mind, and is something that is core to the DNA of CIES and DNA of the FIFA Master program. So Dan, thank you so much on behalf of CIES Podcasts and CIES Talks. It's been a pleasure to really spend this time with you. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as well. Maybe a quick word to our listening audience. Please do check past episodes. We have a number of past episodes already up on our different social media platforms. And there will be new content to come. So please stay tuned. If you have not subscribed to the channels, please do so. And then you will be up to date on what we're talking about as we continue to explore all of the different areas of sport and education and the industry through this wonderful new series, CIES Talks. So Dan, thank you again so much. Have a lovely summer, and all the best.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been really nice speaking to you. I appreciate the therapy session, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Always, Dan. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.